going to introduce our two prominent speakers, and then they'll each speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll take questions from the audience. Rashid Khalidi is the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies in the Department of History at Columbia University. After receiving his doctorate from Oxford University, he taught at the Lebanese University, the American University of Beirut, Georgetown, and the University of Chicago before coming to Columbia. He is the former president of the Middle East Studies Association and a two-time recipient of Mesa's Albert Hourani Book Award. Professor Khalidi was an advisor to the Palestinian delegation during the 1991-93 Arab-Israeli peace negotiations. He is the current editor of the Journal of Palestine Studies and the author of 9 books, among them The Iron Cage, The Story of the Palestinian Struggle for Statehood, Sowing Crisis, American Dominance and the Cold War in the Middle East, and his most recent, Brokers of Deceit, How the U.S. Has Undermined Peace in the Middle East, published last year and highly recommended. Dr. Khalidi, despite being a historian and tasked with examining and analyzing the past, is one of our most prescient voices. He has been engaged in the struggle for Palestinian self-determination for decades and brings to his work both direct experience and outstanding scholarship. Professor Khalidi offers among the most well-researched, nuanced, and astute analyses of the current state of the so-called peace process. So-called because among his many contributions to our understanding is the keen eye focused on the uses and misuses of language to distort not only perception, but policy. Professor Khalidi's work encompasses not only the Middle East and its varied cultures, conflicts, and contradictions, but also the subtle and not so subtle role played by outside actors, mainly the US, Russia, and the EU states. He is able to offer penetrating insights into the very quotidian struggles of ordinary Palestinians traversing the increasingly fraught and punitive terrain of the occupied territories and the daily humiliations therein, as well as shedding light on the often nefarious US efforts to thwart or subvert negotiations and international law. Dr. Khalidi uses bold scholarship to not only inform and educate, but to challenge the geo-hypocrites who persist in contributing to the prolonged dysfunction of the region. Professor Khalidi... Professor Khalidi, with his many articles, fine books, and media appearances both in the US and the Arabic world, has advanced the field of historical scholarship and broadened our understanding of this most complex region. It is an honor to have him here tonight. Dr. Salem is the Vice President of the Middle East Institute, currently leading an initiative on Arab transitions. Prior to joining the Middle East Institute, he was the founding director of the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut, where he built a regional think tank distinguished both by the quality of its policy research and its high regional profile. Just prior to that, from 1999 to 2006, he was the director of the Fares Foundation, and in 1989, he founded and directed the Lebanese Center for Policy Studies, which is Lebanon's leading public policy think tank. Dr. Salem was a professor of political studies at AUB, and in 2002, he served on the Senior Review Committee for the United Nations Development Programme's Arab Human Development Report. He contributes regularly to the Arab and Western press and has been published in numerous journals and newspapers, including New York Times, Foreign Affairs, National Interest, and the Financial Times. Dr. Salem is the author of a number of books and reports on the Middle East, including most recently, Broken Orders, The Causes and Consequences of the Arab Uprising, and Iraq's Tangled Foreign Relations, both of which came out last year, while the year before, he published both Libya's Troubled Transition and Can Lebanon Survive the Syrian Crisis, all a testament to how profoundly prolific and engaged Dr. Salem is. He's an expert on Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Iran, and his many contributions to the ongoing discussions of these critical regions include not just the pressing political situations, but also complex analyses of the economic and cultural dimensions in these societies. He nuances our understanding with an examination of civil society, human rights, and security issues, as well as a most needed analysis of the economic actors and motivations that help shape the situation. In light of recent uprisings, Dr. Salem's insightful and critical evaluations of social justice movements on the ground help us understand the various competing interests and how they will shape the different outcomes in the region. Dr. Salem offers a keen examination of all the ingredients that led to the current state of the uprisings. And if we pay attention to these variables, such as regime strength, corruption, inequality, the rise of Islamic movements, and the exploitation of sectarian divide, then that will certainly help us understand the vastly different trajectories of these attempts at political transformation. Dr. Salem publishes widely in both Arabic and English, and is often called upon by the media to comment on and analyze the current situation in the region. Dr. Salem was also Dr. Khalidi's student at AUB many years ago, and so anything he says in error can be claimed on Dr. Khalidi. So lucky to have these two eminent scholars here this evening. It's with great pleasure that I invite Dr. Salem to the podium.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I almost drowned in the Amtrak train today coming up from DC, but we finally made it. It's a pleasure to be at LAU's New York premises, and I salute the LAU team, President Jabra, and the excellent vice presidents, one of whom is my sister, so I have to say that. And thank you for arranging this event, and thank you for coming out on this rainy day. So when one looks at the Arab world today and tries to, in a few words, surmise what the situation is like, I'm reminded when Boris Yeltsin was asked in the 1990s, the reporters asked him, in a word, how would you describe the situation in Russia? And he said, in a word? They said, yeah, He said, good. They said, no, I mean more than a word. He said, more than a word? I said, yeah, more than a word. He said, not good. But indeed, there's a lot of good forces, good stuff going on since the uprisings, before and after, and a lot of bad things. So it's a very complicated and black and white and gray situation. The title, Lost in Transition, I think is a very apt title. The Arab world is abandoning a dysfunctional past that is no longer working politically and economically, but has not yet arrived at a functional present or figured out what the future will be like. So it's between those two timelines. The dysfunctional past on the political side, the states that we had were generally repressive, one-party or one-family states. The population in these states was increasingly becoming aware and empowered, aware of what's going on in other parts of the world, empowered through different forms of activism and communication. This bargain between, the bargain that had been established in the 50s and 60s was, give us your political rights, we will give you social and economic justice. And this leads me to the other dysfunction, which is the economic dysfunction. It's no coincidence that many of the oil states have managed to survive because they're able to hand out a lot of goods to their people without giving them political rights or political participation. Whereas states like Tunisia or Egypt or Yemen or Syria and so on have not been able to maintain that deal between taking political rights and giving social and economic goods. The states that eventually emerged were sort of crony capitalist rentier states, where big capitalists that were close to power were able to make a lot of money, but high levels of unemployment, high levels of economic inequality. That old social and economic system exploded in 2010 and 2011. The uprisings themselves indeed were started by small youth groups who broke the wall of fear, who broke the old habits of accepting the status quo. But then many other groups joined in, other social strata, other groups from urban areas, from rural areas, and they really became massive uprisings in the various states that they took place. However, these uprisings had no party that organized them, no party really that led them, no leadership that emerged afterwards. And this has a great bearing on what happened in the first elections and the second elections, that these were great uprisings without a party, without a leadership, without anybody to take those uprisings and the momentum of that and turn it into a new political order. These uprisings did put forth a kind of a political vision. They did call for accountable government, elections, a constitution, and so on. But they did not bring forward a new socio-economic vision. In other words, on the political sense, they were pretty much saying we want some kind of democracy. It wasn't very well defined, it wasn't very elaborate, but they knew that something like that is what they wanted. On the social and economic level, they knew they wanted jobs and bread, as the slogan said, but there was no economic model that went along with that. In the revolts of the 1950s, socialism, leftism was the model. In the 70s and 80s, the states introduced liberalism and market economies. These uprisings, although very much was based on economic need and poverty and so on, did not and still have not put forward a new social and economic vision, and that's going to be one of the crippling things as we move forward. The Islamists were movements that had been organized for decades. Unlike other parties and other movements, they were not stamped out completely because they could survive in the mosque systems and in the sort of the cultural belief system. In Tunisia and Egypt and other places, they were ready to win elections after the uprisings took place. The state apparatus also and its political and economic networks in many cases survived the uprisings to come back in different forms under different leaderships, and we'll come back to that. 3 years after the uprisings, we have 4 countries in transition, Yemen, Egypt, Libya, and Tunisia. One country in which the uprising was simply aborted, which is Bahrain, and one in which the uprising led to outright civil war, which is Syria. So a lot has happened in these few years. All the countries of the region, from Morocco to Oman, have been impacted by the new mood, the new dynamics, the new changes in both positive and negative ways. Some of the general trends that we can identify, one is sort of the empowerment of populations, and I think this is more or less a new permanent threshold. It might ebb and flow, but it's a new high of people's boldness, people's empowerment, people feeling that they can bring down governments, they can change history, they can do things. And both in elected governments and in dictatorships or autocracies, rulers now really have to take the street and the people into account, that these people can revolt, they can bring you down in a few weeks, they are a very powerful force. That force will not effectively be put back in the bottle again, and that is a new reality. I think a new paradigm as well is the Arab populations in general, I think, have made clear that some kind of democracy is their preferred political choice. Not a one-party state, not a religious state, not a one-man rule, nor a leftist socialist thing, which was the option in the 50s and 60s. That is a very important historical shift. This has not been the case for about 80, 90 years, that people stand up in their millions and say some form of accountable elected government is the form of government we want. I think it's also fair to say that people in their majority have opted for a civil state, not a religious state. And this brings me to the movements of political Islam. The political Islamist mainstream movements, mainly the Muslim Brotherhood, were best placed to take advantage after the uprisings and win elections, as they did in Tunisia and Egypt. But also there was a very powerful backlash, popular backlash, and in some cases a state backlash against them. Political Islam in recent past was the opposition movement, was almost the only opposition movement. And it was thought by many or assumed by many that they could take the mantle, lead the new movement, sort of like the political Islamic movement in Turkey had evolved and become both a democratic and a kind of a modernist movement and could lead change. This turned out not really to be the case in the countries that it was tried, and that has caused a bit of a deflation of political Islamic momentum. That a few years ago it seemed that the future would be dominated by political Islam. Today, that no longer seems the case. This has gone along with a kind of a resurgence of secularism and nationalism, that a serious secular backlash against attempts of Islamic movement to sort of propose an Islamic society, an Islamic state, an Islamic constitution, an Islamic way forward. This triggered a very strong and I think very healthy and very important reaction among women's groups, secular groups, minority groups, mainstream people who are Muslim and so on, but don't want an Islamist state. And we haven't seen sort of a secular assertion like this for 7 or 8 decades. So that's also very, very significant. It's often mixed with nationalism, because the national symbols often protect a kind of a civil or secular order from the 50s and 60s, and it's important that that was, in a sense, reasserted against an Islamist attempt. So the forces of political Islam, nationalism, secularism, and all these different groups are certainly at play, as well as a very powerful counter-revolution. This is forces of the deep state, which sort of took a back seat during the early parts of the uprisings, but have come back in a powerful way, for example, in Egypt, and might have a big determining influence over the future. Also, the regional patterns in the Middle East have changed dramatically. A few years ago, it seemed that Turkey and Qatar were sort of riding the wave of this new movement, that they would be the dominant players. Iran already had a very strong influence in Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, and Gaza. Perhaps the Iranian arc is still present, although very much challenged in Syria. But the Turkey-Qatar axis or pattern has been certainly challenged and effectively replaced by a Saudi, Emirati, Kuwaiti, GCC resurgence in Egypt and other places to try to impose their points of view. And that has very much changed the regional patterns. The US has certainly reduced its presence, reduced its involvement. Russia is more active. China has some activity as well. So in the last 3 years, the Middle East's international and regional relations have also changed dramatically. Also, when you look regionally, there's a huge difference between the Levant, the eastern part of the Middle East, and Egypt and North Africa, the western part of the Middle East. Egypt and North Africa are not, they have two things that the Levant has two challenges that Egypt and North Africa do not. The Levant has deep sectarian and ethnic divisions, obviously along Arab Kurdish and Sunni Shiite, and in some cases Christian Muslim axes. But the Sunni Shiite division in the east with the Iranian Saudi competition makes it a very, very dangerous part of the Middle East. Whereas Egypt and North Africa, yes, there's some sectarian identities, particularly in Egypt, but otherwise it doesn't have deep ethnic and sectarian divisions. Nor does Egypt and North Africa fall in a geopolitically contested region. No, but in other words, Iran is not fighting for Egypt or Tunisia and so on with Saudi Arabia and so on. So we might see a more steady pattern in North Africa, whereas in the Levant we see civil war in Syria, we see near civil war in Iraq, there's elections today in Iraq, and we see simmering civil war and political accommodation in Lebanon. So very different regions. The transitions, although they were started by the same hopes and the same dreams, and they were transferred over Arab media and the same sort of slogans, they have gone in completely different directions. Some have led hesitantly towards democratization in various degrees. Some have led straight into terrible civil wars. So a similar impulse has led in completely different directions. And to try to understand how that could be the case, I'll just cite a number of variables. One is from country to country. One is the amount of national cohesion. Tunisia is a very cohesive country, very homogeneous. Syria is not. National cohesion. Regime cohesion. Is the regime sticking together? Is it divided? Are there internal divisions? That has a big impact. What is the role of leaders and different political parties? Tunisia had fairly able leaders, both in the Islamist and the non-Islamist camp. They were able to negotiate a way forward. Egypt has had a dearth of powerful leaders in civil society and political parties to try to find a way other than either the Muslim Brotherhood or the army. Tunisia has found a way forward. And another variable, of course, is the external environment, as I mentioned. Are you in an area contested by Saudi Arabia and Iran, or in a calmer region of the Middle East. Taking a cursory look at the various countries, I'll just mention a few going from east to west, because each one is kind of an interesting case, and when you see them all together, you get a very kind of interesting view. Yemen is a country in a way that's transitioning, but in a way transitioning to nowhere, in the sense that there is a process, there's a national dialogue. The Yemenis have a long tradition of power sharing. Yes, it's tribal and regional and so on. They've had encouragement from the Gulf, from the US and so on. Their environment has sort of helped them in a way avoid complete collapse or large civil war, and are limping along. But I say transition to nowhere because Yemen, even before the uprisings, was a failing state. It's running out of water, it's running out of money. Literacy and poverty is about 50%. It's a state that is failing because of resource issues. The central government was not able to control the country, is not able to control all the parts, and hence, even though there are encouraging and important steps of conciliation and steps forward, it is still a country that is sort of sinking into sort of resource poverty. Syria, obviously, a country that attempted to transition, attempted to reform. The regime responded by turning it into a civil war, and we all know what an utter disaster Syria has turned into. I think Syria, as the Syria we knew, no longer exists. I don't speak of a post-Assad Syria, I speak of a post-Syria Syria. How many Syrias will there be? How long will it take for this war to end? A decade and a half? What will be left at the end of it? This is a tremendous tragedy, and one we can go back to it. Iraq, I mentioned in the countries of transition, even though it started its transition about 10 years ago, but it's still in transition. There are elections today in Iraq. Iraq, I would say, in the last 5 years was making progress, but it is now moving backwards over the past 2 years. The Kurds are on the verge of revolt. The Sunni-Shia relations are beyond the breaking point. Al-Qaeda is back strong in a number of Iraqi regions. I think if Maliki secures a third term, this might be the last elections in a united Iraq. We might see a completely different situation. If other forces prevail and Iraq can produce a conciliatory, a coalition kind of government led by a leader other than Maliki, I think Iraq can save itself and move forward. It has done reasonably well in the last 5 years, but in the last year or two, it's been sliding dangerously backward. I want to mention Lebanon, not because I'm from Lebanon, but Lebanon, in a sense, has been a country in transition for a century. It's still not able to transition to a really effective and functioning democracy. It is democratic in a sense, but it is a democracy based on sectarian power sharing. And since the 1950s, people have been trying to jump from that sort of very divided reality to something more functional. And that has still not been the case. Lebanon is trying in these weeks to elect a new president, not able to do so. Egypt, obviously a key country in all of this. A massive uprising in 2011 and several uprisings after that. It's gone through 3 regimes since 2011. Mubarak, removal of Mubarak, the SCAF, the Supreme Council for the Armed Forces, the removal of that, President Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood for a year, uprising against that, then a coup against that, now a transition with a government backed by the military, and in a few weeks probably President Sisi from the military probably will win the presidency for 4 years. Egypt is a very complicated situation. We can come back to it. The Muslim Brotherhood had an opportunity to lead a transition, an inclusive one. They chose not to. There's a lot of, one can go back to the details of that. They are now certainly under repression from the military, but also there was a wide rejection of their leadership in the year, particularly the last 6 months of their rule, and we can come back to it. Egypt has enormous challenges, not least of which are the social and economic challenges of Egypt. And if any new administration doesn't tackle them boldly, Egypt cannot get out of the deep pit that it is in. Libya is a country that succeeded in removing a dictator but ended up without a state. It is maintained, like Lebanon, the ability, everybody's armed, there's militias all over the place. It has not gone into civil war, it has not exploded or imploded, but they are still in the very early stages of trying to build the basics of a state, an army, a police, basic institutions. What it has going for it, perhaps, is they have a lot of oil wealth. That could be positive or negative. It's not a terribly large population. So unlike Egypt, which has serious challenges of poverty and things of that nature, Libya, with a bit of cooperation and movement forward, could at least take care of its 6 million population with the vast oil wealth that they have. Tunisia is the most successful, I would say, so far, although still not out of the woods. They were in very difficult conditions in 2013. There were assassinations, there were massive protests. And it's possible that the events of Egypt in June and July of 2013 sobered the Tunisian leadership, both among the Islamists and others, and encouraged them to go ahead and find a compromise. And indeed they did. And they passed a wonderful constitution in January of this year by broad consensus. They now have to hold elections and move forward. They still have many challenges and many problems, but they've done well in the transition, both probably the most successful. Other big countries that remain sort of in the future in the balance, the biggest is probably Algeria. Algeria perhaps didn't have an uprising for two reasons. One, they recently had a civil war, so they don't want to go through that again. Secondly, they have vast oil wealth. So still that is a factor that the government can still manage to some degree to maintain some level of public acceptance, although it's really been at the breaking point for a long time. It's a sad comment on the Algerian political system that although the president couldn't walk, he could run for president, and he is now the president. So it just tells you how bankrupt the political system is. The regime is trying to engineer a transition under the current president. They haven't yet figured out how to do it, but to try to preserve the regime by choosing some person to inherit power. So it's a very mixed picture, a very difficult picture. But if one steps back and looks at other transitions in other countries, transitions are always difficult. I think the Arab world is in a transition because, as I started off saying, the old systems politically and economically simply no longer work. The publics are now aware and very empowered, and they want a more inclusive and a more accountable form of government. They'll keep trying. There will be many failures, and there have been many failures along the way. This is a process that is probably to be counted in decades, not in years. The Arab world, unfortunately, attempted transition at a time that wasn't very auspicious. The West was certainly not in a situation to help or extend any major support. In the region, the uprisings and pro-democracy glimmerings were met with fear and kind of a counter-revolution. So it wasn't a very auspicious place to attempt it. Central and Eastern Europe had the EU standing by to welcome them and support them. Nevertheless, I think this is a process that will have to move forward. What is gravely missing from this movement, as I mentioned early in my remarks, is there is sort of an understanding of what the politics should look like, constitution that's inclusive and so on. A number of countries have drafted new constitutions, which are generally pretty good, but there is no socio-economic vision. There's no new economic model. And at the end of the day, if the economies of these countries, the non-oil countries, if they're not transformed to create growth and jobs for the young people and for their large populations, we will just see cycle after cycle of revolt and revolution. And with that, I will thank you, and I'll...
Good evening. Thank you all for coming out in this miserable weather. While I was being introduced in this lavishly laudatory introduction by Samantha, thank you very much. Thank you to LAU for bringing me here. While I was being introduced, I remembered that I once taught at LAU under a different name. It was then BCW. I was a graduate student back in the early 70s in Beirut, and I taught, I think it was the equivalent of CC for a summer. This is one of the last times I've ever taught in the summer. I'll never do it again. Not because of LAU. I just don't like teaching in the summer. I'm going to talk about some of the very same things that Paul did, but Paul is a political scientist. In spite of the fact I taught him, I didn't teach him everything he knows. He knows a great deal more than I taught him. And I'm a historian. And I just realized yesterday, when I finished my last class of the semester, for which I am very grateful, that I have just completed 40 years of teaching as of yesterday. I still haven't corrected the papers, but I'm done with the teaching. I started when I was 14. So. I was 19 when I taught you, barely older than. When I started teaching at the Lebanese University and then at the American University in Beirut in the mid-1970s, the Arab world looked like most of the rest of the non-Euro-American world, which is to say that it was dominated by authoritarian, non-democratic, non-parliamentary, non-constitutional regimes. It wasn't particularly unusual in that. Eastern Europe was under communism. Latin America had horrific military dictatorships. Africa was ruled by post-independence one-party states. South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia had jackboot military dictatorships, one-party regimes. There were a few, very few exceptions. India. But you had Marcos, you had Pak Chung-hee, you had the Kuomintang in Formosa, in Taiwan. You had horrific governments everywhere. And the Middle East, in fact, didn't stand out. It had authoritarian regimes just like everybody else. Today, with a very few exceptions, the Arab world is still dominated by largely authoritarian regimes, whether they're military mukhabarat regimes or whether they're absolute monarchies, or whether they're absolute monarchies masquerading as something else. The only real exceptions are Lebanon, which Paul mentioned, for all the complications in Lebanon, for all the civil wars, for all the external intervention. There have been constitutional changes of government ever since independence. And in that, Lebanon is unique, however much you may criticize the system. One of the other partial exceptions is Kuwait, where you actually have a parliament and some elements of real democracy. But with those minor exceptions, the Middle East still looks like it did in 1974 when I started teaching. I just finished teaching a course on constitutions and democracy in the Middle East from the 19th century till today. And one of the main lessons that the students, I think, drew from this course was that the Middle East was not always like this. The Middle East was one of the first areas outside of Europe where constitutions were established, in the Ottoman Empire in 1876, in Iran in 1905, 1906. And the Middle East actually had parliamentary regimes in most of the independent and semi-independent countries of the region for most of the first half of the 20th century. So it has been dominated by authoritarian regimes for many decades now, certainly since the 60s or 70s. But it was not always like that. There was a drift towards authoritarianism from the first coups in Syria in 1949 through the 1960s. But before that, it actually looked quite different. One of the things that the students learned was that these parliamentary constitutional systems, whether in the Ottoman Empire or later on in the successor states, Iraq or Egypt or Syria, all failed. None of them was a success, nor the Egyptian constitutional regime from 1922 to 1952, nor the Syrian, nor the Iraqi, nor none of them except for that. The only exception, actually, was Lebanon, the only one that survived. They were sabotaged by deep social problems that those governments couldn't deal with. They were sabotaged by greedy oligarchies that were jealous of their power. The landowners in Egypt would not give up power. But very importantly, they were foiled, their efforts were foiled by external interference, and often by overt foreign military intervention. Iraq was re-invaded in 1941. In 1953, the parliamentary regime in Iran was brought down by an American-British coup. Those are obvious, overt examples of intervention. But if you look at the parliamentary politics of Egypt in the 1920s or 1930s, it was not just the Wafd and the palace and the opposition parties, it was the British ambassador telling the Egyptians what to do. In 1942, they insisted, by driving tanks through the gates of King Farouk's palace, that they bring a specific government to power. How can a parliamentary system function in a country that's not sovereign. And that was one of the many problems that parliamentary regimes in all of these countries faced. Now, the shift to authoritarianism in the Middle East and elsewhere, I think, was very much reinforced in the decades after World War II by the Cold War. This turn to authoritarianism was in part a result of the fact that both the United States and the Soviet Union propped up or helped put into power regimes which simply would do what they wanted, were aligned with them, were ones that would go along with them in terms of Cold War politics. They didn't really care very much about their internal politics. If they said they were socialists, the Soviets were happier. But Yemen was never a socialist country, North Yemen. They aligned with Yemen. They didn't really care. The United States didn't care either. Whatever kind of regime it was, as long as it was anti-communist, against communism locally, willing to align itself with the United States regionally and globally, that's all the United States cared for. There was no concern at any stage of the Cold War by either superpower for the promotion of democracy or constitutionalism. Obviously, the Soviet Union wouldn't promote it, but neither did the United States. And this was a factor that operated not just in the Middle East, it operated everywhere. It operated in Central America, it operated everywhere. And in Africa and so forth. Now, something changed in most of the world with the end of the Cold War. And it didn't maybe change because of the Cold War, but I think the end of the Cold War helped it. So with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, with the end of communism in the Soviet Union in 1990, and the disappearance of the Soviet Union in 1991, there was a major shift. These Cold War imperatives no longer operated. Some countries were freed as a direct result of this. So the Eastern European countries were able to adopt democratic regimes. But the same kind of loosening, I think, affected Latin America, East Asia, South Asia, and many parts even of Africa. And this was a worldwide trend. If you look at those countries in 1960, and you look at those countries in 2000, you will see dozens and dozens of countries that were jackboot military dictatorships that have functioning, albeit corrupt, ramshackle, not terribly satisfactory democracies. Corruption and not terribly satisfactorily functioning systems is often a condition of democracy. I lived for 16 years in Chicago, and I can tell you that we had 52 aldermen. 30 of them were not just accused of crimes, were not just indicted, were convicted and went to jail in the 16 years I was in Chicago. That is the condition of democracy, where you have a rule of law. People are corrupt, they steal, they're convicted, they go to jail. Someone else is elected, they're corrupt, they're convicted, they go to jail. That's how it should work. But that is how it works. And anybody who thinks it's something different is reading too much political theory and not actually looking at the real world that they live in. So there have been those changes everywhere else, these shifts towards democracy, except in one place, the Arab world. Middle East generally, but specifically the Arab world. Paul has talked, I think, and I can skip some of the things I wanted to talk about regarding the Arab Spring. All I will say about the so-called Arab Spring is that it may have begun a process which may eventually lead to a stable and constitutional, to a stable constitutional and democratic order in some Arab states. But as Zhou Enlai said of the French Revolution, when he was asked, what do you think of the French Revolution? He said, it's too early to tell. And so it's too early to tell. I mean, this may well lead in those directions. I'm optimistic, but that may not be a process for 2015-16. That may be a process for 2024-25 or longer. If you look carefully, of the 6 Arab states that have experienced radical upheaval, revolutionary upheaval, Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain, and Syria, only 1, maybe 2, may be on the path to a stable democracy. Exactly what you said. I mean, Tunisia would be the only one. Yemen, yani. So I would argue, and this is one of the things I want to talk about tonight. This is the main thing I want to talk about tonight. I would argue that there is an Arab exception. The Arabs are exceptional. The Arab states are exceptional in terms of this wave of democratization that has affected every single part of the world except the Arab world since the 1970s and 80s, since the end of the Cold War, in other words. backwards. And I want to ask that question, a couple questions. Why is this the case? Is this because the Arabs are particularly backwards? I actually don't think that's the reason. I could give many. You worked on this, these indices of, you were one of the authors of the report, showing that in fact the Arab world has all kinds of ways in which it's more or less advanced than other parts of the world, but many of these areas I've talked about have much lower levels of literacy, and they've established functioning democratic systems. India has a huge level of illiteracy, much higher than most Arab countries. They've managed. So I don't think it's absolute backwardness. Is it Islam? Some people argue that Islam is incompatible with democracy. These are people who I think are obsessed with the Arab world. Most Muslims are not in the Middle East. Most Muslims are, the center of gravity of Islam is somewhere east of Dhaka. Most Muslims live in East Asia, Southeast Asia, and South Asia. Overwhelming majority, 1 billion of them, live way east of the Middle East. And if you look at most Muslim majority countries, most of them are democratic. They're terrible regimes. I wouldn't particularly want to live in Bangladesh, but they have elections. They have 2 corrupt parties. They accuse each other of the most horrible things. They're both headed by women, as it happens. It's fine. Nothing wrong with that. They are women. Sheikha Hasina, I mean, they're women. What can I do? I'm stating a fact. They're just as corrupt as anybody else, is the point. But they are there because of elections. They're not there because someone came in with a tank or someone came in with a gun and put them there. And that's true in Malaysia, and that's true in Indonesia, and that's true even in Pakistan. So that's true in Turkey, that's true in Nigeria. These are countries with enormous problems, but they have democratic regimes. They're majority Muslim countries. So clearly, Islam is not the answer to this question, why is there an Arab exception? And I'm not going to torture you by giving you a variety of false leads. I'm going to suggest a couple of main reasons why in the Middle East, and in particular in the Arab countries, we have this exception. And I'm going to focus only on 2 reasons. I think there are many, but I will only focus on 2 that I think historically can be shown to have functioned in ways that have inhibited the growth of democratic regimes. The first, very simply put, is war. Paul very acutely pointed out that North Africa is different than the countries of the Mashriq. And it is. And one reason it's different is there are smaller armies. There has been less conflict, interstate conflict. There's been a civil war in Algeria. There's been some interstate conflict involving Libya. But by comparison with Iraq, which has been essentially at war since 1980, without exception, without 1 year in which there were not huge numbers of civilian casualties to violence, by comparison with almost any country of the Levant, of the Mashriq, which has experienced, if not the Arab-Israeli war, the Iraq-Iran war, internal conflict. The countries of North Africa have not experienced war. And so if there is likely to be a transition, I would suggest it might, if this factor of war is as important as I suggest, it might be more likely in that region for this reason among many others. I won't go through all the wars that the Middle East has experienced. You know about the various wars Iraq was involved in, the insane suicidal war against Iran, a larger country. As stupid as what Hitler did attacking the Soviet Union was what Saddam did in attacking Iran. He basically destroyed the flower of the youth of Iraq and a lot of the youth of Iran with that megalomaniacal decision. He then invaded Kuwait, leading to horrific American sanctions and the death of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis from sanctions. And the United States then invaded Iraq. Iraq has been subject to a civil war ever since 2003. In no month since 2003 have there been less than 500 civilian casualties as a result of violence. In the worst 2 years of the war, in 2006 and 2007, there were 2,000 civilian casualties, deaths from violence every single month. In the last year, there have been 1,000 deaths as a result of violence. Every month, civilians who died. If you count combatants, the number is even higher. You go up to maybe 200,000 people over the past 11 years. If you count indirect deaths as a result of civil conflict, as many as 450,000 Iraqis have died. This is a civil war. It's a low-grade, constant, unceasing civil war for 11 years since the American invasion. Syria is now undergoing the same thing at a much higher level. Lebanon underwent the same thing at a slightly lower level, but for a longer period. So 3 countries in the Mashriq have been devastated, their societies, their governmental systems, their populations, their educational systems, by long-term civil war. And I unfortunately am afraid that the Syrian war is going to fit that pattern of a long-term civil war. So when we talk about war, we're not just talking about Iran, Iraq, or the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq. We're not just talking about the Arab-Israeli wars. We're not just talking about the kind of conflict that we know about vis-a-vis Palestine. We know about those wars. We're not just talking about the Yemeni civil war. We're talking about long-term civil wars in several of these countries in addition to interstate conflict. And I want to read you something, because I think war does something really, really important to states. And I'll tell you who said this when I've read it to you. A very wise statesman. Of all the enemies of true liberty, war is perhaps the most dreaded, because it comprises and develops the germ of every other. War is the parent of armies, and this is true of civil strife and of interstate war. So think of these civil conflicts as well as interstate wars. War is the parent of armies. From these proceed debt and taxes, and armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for bringing the many under the domination of the few. Dictatorship. He goes on, in war too is the discretionary power of the executive extended. Its influence in dealing out offices, honors, and emoluments is multiplied, and all the means of seducing the minds. Think of Egypt under the military now, or under Abdel Nasser, or Syria, or any country, or Iraq under the Ba'ath. And all the means of seducing the minds are added to those of subduing the force of the people. I'm skipping a passage. He concludes, no nation can preserve its freedom in the midst of continual warfare. War is, in fact, the true nurse of executive aggrandizement. What is democracy? What are parliaments? What are constitutions? But limits on the power, absolute power of the executive. That's what Magna Carta was. That's what the English Revolution was. That's what the Glorious Revolution of 1688 was. That's what the French Revolution was. That's what the American and the Haitian revolutions were. They were limits on the absolute power of a ruler. And what this person, this was James Madison, writing in 1795, what Madison was saying is war means dictatorship. Okay? You cannot have democracy. You cannot have liberty. You cannot have any of the things that we're talking about, democracy, parliamentary government, constitutions, in a condition of permanent war, continual, what he calls continual warfare. So I'm arguing not that you cannot ever have democracy in this region because there's so much conflict, but I'm arguing that this is an inhibiting factor, a major inhibiting factor for democracy. What is the other? I'm going to be very blunt here. Nobody in the Middle East wants to talk about this, but I think we should start talking about it, even though all the television stations and all the newspapers, not all of them, most of them, many research centers all over the world depend on what I'm talking about. We should talk about it anyway. I think the second major reason that inhibits democracy in the Middle East is oil revenues in the hands of absolute monarchs. The Middle East, since the 1970s, is just like Europe after the French Revolution. In the decades since the oil price spikes of 1973, 40 years, are just like Europe after the French Revolution. They had the Romanovs, they had the Habsburgs, they had the Hohenzollerns, they had absolute monarchs determined to stamp out liberty, freedom, democracy, parliaments, constitutions. And they sent their armies and their secret police and their money all over Europe to destroy freedom, democracy, parliaments, and constitutions. Not only in 89, 90, 91, when they sent their armies into France, but again when the French Revolution erupted in 1848, they did the same thing. And in the interim, between those two revolutions, they kept fighting for absolutism against constitutionalism and democracy. We have our Habsburgs and our Romanovs. They were Hatta Igal. And they speak Arabic, but they're playing precisely the same function in the Arab world with infinitely greater financial resources and no armies, obviously. The power of the Petro checkbook is combined with a powerful anti-democratic, anti-constitutional ideological tool, which is Wahhabism. Wahhabism, as it has developed in Saudi Arabia as an instrument of state power, is a doctrine which says there is no place in a proper Muslim society for constitutions. There is no place for democracy. Absolute rule is the proper form of governance, because it's the only thing that guarantees religion in their vision, and because of other reasons. This is a powerful, powerful ideological tool. It is a tool, an anti-democratic tool, and it is wielded by people, some of whom are not under the control of any government. I mean, the people in Fallujah today, the people in the eastern part of Syria today, Daesh, are not subordinated to any government. They're doing whatever they want. But the ideology grew out of this lethal, toxic, in my personal view, heretical, non-Islamic variant on Salafi Islam. I would argue that these are two plagues of democracy in the Middle East. Long-term grinding conflict, whether civil war or war, interstate war, and unlimited wealth derived from oil in the hands of oligarchs, firmly supported by outside forces. The core of this is an American-Saudi alliance that goes back to 1933. The oldest American alliance in the Middle East is not the alliance with Israel. The American-Saudi relationship goes back 15 years before there was an Israel. It goes back to an oil deal signed in 1933, what became Aramco, turned into a military alliance in 1945, and has been the core of American Middle East policy ever since. So these oligarchs have unlimited oil wealth. They're supported by outside forces. And in my view, they've really dominated the regional system since the Yemen Civil War of the 60s, since the 67 war, or since the oil price spike of 1973, whichever date you choose to take. These regimes have dominated the regional system. So war and oil, or the effect of oil wealth in the hands of autocrats, I think, are very important in explaining why the Middle East has developed in the way it has. I could give an interpretation of why these regimes do what they do. I think that we can leave that for questions. Let me conclude by asking, will this anti-democratic trend succeed? And secondly, let me ask, is the continuation of war and civil conflict that strengthens absolute power inevitable in the Middle East? I don't know how the future is going to develop. I often say that predicting the future is not part of the job description of a historian. I don't know what's going to happen. I can't tell you. I don't even think a political scientist can tell you, but they can do a better job than we can. You can try. We don't even try. They try, we don't try. But I think there are important trends, some of which I think were accurately described by Paul. And I'm not going to talk about trends within Arab society, because I think he actually put his finger on the ones I would have talked about. So I'm going to skip that. I do believe that there are powerful desires for democracy and for liberty in most Arab societies, repressed, foiled, sometimes countered by the desire for stability and just peace. And enough. We don't care. Just leave us alone. But those desires are there, especially with the younger generation. And the younger generation is the overwhelming majority of Arab society. They will have their way sooner or later. But I'm not sure about that, and I would leave, as I say, I would leave that to you. But I would argue about conflict. Much conflict in the Middle East is artificially fomented or is externally fomented. For example, the absurd, poisonous Sunni-Shia conflict in the Middle East. Some of us, when we think of sectarianism, think of the kind of sectarianism that Lebanon experienced in the 1970s. That is nothing compared to the sectarian hatreds that exist today in countries like Iraq or Yemen, the Gulf countries, Syria, Lebanon. Nothing as toxic as these Sunni-Shia conflicts. These are externally fomented. These do not rise out of Lebanese and Iraqi and Syrian society. They rise out of some of the same trends I've talked about and other trends coming from Iran. Another externally fomented conflict is the Arab-Israeli conflict. The Arab-Israeli conflict is not an indigenous conflict. It's a conflict that's always been a result of external support for Israel. If there were not external support for Israel, you would not have the absurd balance of forces that you've had really since 1948. And I see two trends, which are long-term trends. I would not necessarily predict anything about them, but these are trends that are definitely exist in 2014, and they have deep roots, and I believe they may well continue to develop. The first is a trend to diffuse the American-Iranian conflict, which has been going on since 1979. There is a body of good sense in the American business community, most importantly, and among a minority of American policy intellectuals, which say that there is absolutely no reason for this conflict continuing. There are contradictions between the interests of the United States and Iran, but there is absolutely no reason for a continuation into a fourth decade of an American-Iranian Cold War, which has been going on since 1979, 35 years. There's absolutely no reason for it. There can be differences between countries, and there will be differences between the United States and Iran. But this administration, at least, seems committed not just to a nuclear deal, but potentially to a broader deal with Iran, at least trying to diffuse this conflict. And I think that this conflict, that is to say the American-Iranian Cold War, contributes mightily to this Sunni Shia, Iranian-Saudi regional Cold War. I could go into this, but I really frankly think that should the United States succeed in coming at least to a nuclear deal with Iran, the configuration of the entire region vis-a-vis regional conflicts would be changed. And there's the potential for some of these things changing fundamentally. Secondly, I think that the patience of the American public with the extraordinary bias of U.S. policy in favor of Israel is coming to an end. American people are not very clear on the concepts in the Middle East. They don't know much about the Middle East, most Americans. They don't know much about most of the world. They don't know many languages. America, the United States, is the most monoglot country on earth. Fewer people speak languages here than almost any other country in the world. But Americans are beginning to figure some things out about the Middle East. And one of the things that a lot of them are figuring out is this tilt just doesn't make sense. The Israelis are not tiny little David against a Palestinian Goliath. It just does not compute. And the younger you are, the less that absurd picture, which has been sold successfully by the best public relations that money can buy for generation after generation to everybody over 40 or 50. It just doesn't wash. Kids don't believe it. Zionist kids don't believe it. Pro-Israel kids don't believe it. They see Israel as a bully. I mean, I had a kid who was the head of the pro-Israel lobby at Columbia in my office this afternoon during my office hours, talking about how nasty the Israelis are to the Palestinians. Those are pro-Israel kids. 20-year-olds, 22-year-olds. So if that's where people who are, have been indoctrinated since they were kids are, imagine how ordinary Americans who come to figure out something about the United States are. I think that that's beginning to affect the policy elite, which is generally impervious to public opinion. They live in a world of their own inside the Beltway. It's a reality-free zone, Washington. And if you utter the truth, some people look at you. The emperor has no clothes. Oh my God, how can you say that the emperor has no clothes? But even those people are beginning to be afflicted by vague sense that maybe this policy is not serving the national interest of the United States. You had people like General Petraeus, people like Admiral Mullen, people like Secretary Gates a few years ago saying very bluntly that American bias in favor of Israel is extremely harmful to American national interests. You had President Obama come out and say, we're not going to do what Israel wants on Iran, and say to Congress, you don't like my policy on Iran? You want to go to war? That's the alternative. And it is the alternative. That's what Netanyahu wants. That's what Israel wants. And that's not in the national interest of the United States. It's not in the political interest of any president. And it's not going to happen for that reason. So there's a beginning of a change in this. And I would argue that over time, these two developments may help to diffuse regional conflict, may help to weaken the Israeli-American alliance and the Saudi-American alliance. And those, in my view, are among the bulwarks of the anti-democratic status quo in the Middle East. So if I'm right, I may not be, if I'm right, then this is something to look forward to. Thanks.
Thank you. I mean, two great presentations. I wonder if I can interest you in talking a little bit more about the drivers of the U.S. foreign policy in shaping what happened in the Arab Spring or whatever upheavals in the last 3 years. I mean, it was not, I think there was a reference to the U.S. playing a lesser role. It was not really, in my view, a lesser role. I mean, still in Yemen, it's driving the war on terror. In Iraq, it started the whole dynamic in Iraq. In Syria, at one stage, when everybody thought Syria will change, that's when Obama threatened to bombard Syria over chemical weapons. In Libya, if it was not for the Americans, Gaddafi might have been there until now. In Egypt, the few Apache helicopters and the hundreds of millions of dollars in military aid, all of that is shaping how the transition in these countries is moving forward. And my question is, I mean, oil aside and the Israeli-American relationship, what is really moving the U.S. foreign policy in shaping the Arab Spring? Because at the end of the day, yes, the Gulf countries, the Emirate, Kuwaiti, Saudi alliance is shaping a lot of what's happening in Syria and Egypt, and they buy like hundreds of billions of dollars of arms in America, but when they need protection, it is the U.S. that they run to. So still the U.S., in my view, is the shaper of what is happening now in the region, but for the life of me, I don't understand what is shaping the U.S. foreign policy in the region now, or the lack thereof.
I would argue only two things in response to this question. The first thing I would argue is that American policy is very much shaped by inertia in the face of a lot of these issues. The United States felt a commitment to Mubarak, and it clung to Mubarak, and then to the Majlis al-A'la as long as it could. These were elements of what were seen as stability, and I think they did the same in every Arab country. And where you have an ongoing American involvement, like in Yemen, in an internal conflict with using drones to attack people, that's another, as it were, element of inertia. The policy goes on without reflection, without thinking, without criticism, without review. And I think that has driven American policy. That's one driver. I would argue the second driver is this extraordinary connection to the Arab autocracies. The Arab autocracies only survive because of external protection. None of these countries can protect itself against its own citizens, let alone external enemies. When the Saudi army got into a firefight with the Houthis won. The Saudi army buys extraordinary amounts of weaponry. They cannot use them. They're not meant to be used. They are meant as a gauge of Saudi support for the American economy, in return for which the United States will support Saudi Arabia. The United States, in 2011, exported $66 billion worth of arms. 44 billion of those 66 billion went to the Arab oil autocracies. That is not money that is being spent on defense. That is money that is being spent for insurance. We will support a defense industry that is struggling because of budget cuts. We will put $44 billion in weapons that will rust in the desert in order for you to protect us. And that's to my way of thinking, this is a core element of American policy. And it's not just defense, it's aerospace. It's not just aerospace, it's contractors. It's not just contractors. It's Chevrolets and Cadillacs and GMC and Caterpillar. Every corporation you name, every bank you name, every big real estate broker you can name in New York, in Paris, in London, is partially dependent on the money that's coming out of the oil autocracies. So there's a nexus, which to my way of thinking overrides the American aspiration for democracy in Tunisia or wherever else it may be. There's another factor which operated in Syria, I think, and it's similar to the factor that operated in terms of vis-a-vis Iran, which is that the American military, the American intelligence community, and the diplomats, when asked, told the president, an intervention in Syria will be unlimited in scope. It will lead to these possibilities, and that may have these consequences. And when the president looked at what he was being told by all of his advisors, and he was not, he backed out. He just completely changed course. So that's a specific, but that's a specific. Those would be my two general answers: inertia, and it goes right back to this alliance with the oil autocracies. I don't know if you want to add something. Turn this.
My main point, I mean, the uprisings themselves and the major historical dynamics were very, very domestic. That it really these were surprising and massive popular revolts. The U.S. didn't know about them. The regimes who have immense intelligence networks were very surprised by the extent of what happened. Then the U.S. made certain decisions in certain areas which made or did not make a difference. Libya is an obvious example. The non-action in Syria is another example as well. The U.S. administration, when all of this happened under Obama, was sort of, it almost had sort of I would almost say a negative policy. It knew what it didn't want to do. It didn't really have much positive objectives. It wanted to withdraw from Iraq and was doing so, wanted to withdraw from Afghanistan, didn't want to get involved anywhere else, had identified that certainly Gulf security, Israel, the war on terror, those are given. Everything else is really not a major priority for Obama. And obviously Obama is mainly a domestic president, given how he came to power and what he inherited. And during the phases of the uprisings, the administration went through a lot of shifts. It was surprised when they first happened. Surprisingly, I say they quickly abandoned Mubarak, much quicker than the Gulf countries wanted them to. Obama very careful wanting to be, as he says, on the right side of history so that the future will be positive. Went with the Muslim Brotherhood when they won the election, stayed with them much longer than the Egyptian people themselves stayed with them, sort of paid a price for that. None of it really part of a grand master plan. The Bush administration had a plan. It went terribly wrong, but they had one. A colleague said, interestingly, he said Bush took the U.S. into the Middle East without a strategy. Obama took the U.S. out of the Middle East without a strategy, interestingly. And, there are also problems emerging as well. The moment we're living right now, interestingly, is a post-Ukraine, post-Crimea moment, when I think it's become obvious to the administration that there is no U.S.-Russian track, there is no middle way. We're back to a kind of a Cold War situation. And in the Middle East, you've seen a quick shift by the Obama administration to send Apaches to Egypt, go back to your friends, talk to the Saudis, Kuwaitis, Emiratis. We're back in a who's with us, who's against us. And Obama's attempt to talk to Russia and find a middle ground obviously completely collapsed. The U.S.-Iranian track, interestingly, is still very much alive and could change the region.
Actually, I just wonder, why do we consider that democracy is something that anybody can import? It has to grow. If we take the history of democracy in the whole world, it took ages to develop in every single country that it is applying it now. And even under our own eyes, democracy in America is being taken away from them by the money people paying the idiots. And now it's the same kind of democracy in Egypt and in many of the Arab worlds, where the illiterates are the ones who are paid to vote. Democracy has to grow step by step. And illiterates should not be allowed to vote. In America, when did women start to vote? So I'm really surprised that I haven't heard this word, that for a solution, there has to be a way to allow democracy to grow in the Middle East and not to blame them all the time. Don't you think so? Thank you.
One of the best functioning democracies in the non-Western world is India's democracy, where illiterates do vote and where they actually have wielded political power very successfully. Now, illiterates? I mean, have you listened to some members of the U.S. Congress recently? I mean, they may be technically literate, but I mean, everybody in the United States reads and writes. The congressmen, congresswomen, senators, they're all literate, but I mean, some of them utter the most unspeakable imbecilities. That's democracy. I mean, I hate to quote Winston Churchill. He was a horrific colonialist, but he's right. This is the least bad system there is. And I agree with one thing I think you may be saying, which is that it does take time to develop a culture of democracy. And it's not easy. But the Middle East is not the only region which has the kind of social problems that we have. It's not the only region that's had decades and decades and decades of horrible jackboot dictatorships. I mean, we're not alone in the world. And somehow South Korea has democracy and the Philippines has democracy. Countries that had horrific governments for generations have managed to, Indonesia, Malaysia, I could go on and listing dozens of countries that they manage. I mean, I agree with you that to get people to understand how to compromise, to get people to understand that winning an election doesn't mean you have absolute power. These are things that require a certain amount of education. One of the things that has to be said about the Lebanese system is that most Lebanese actually understand these things. They actually understand them. It's not a perfect country in any way, but those kinds of basic lessons of democracy, they do understand. And it takes time. That's true, but you got to start. And other countries have started, and they've failed and succeeded and failed and succeeded. I don't see why we can't follow that path.
Thank you both for excellent presentations. I have two questions, if I may, but they may be short. The first one is that yesterday, the last futile round of negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis under the sponsorship of the United States ended. Where do we go now? Is there any other rounds of this type? Or maybe there will be a new way now. My second question is regarding the U.S. policy in Syria. Since the uprising broke in Syria, there was a lot of blame that the U.S. does not have a policy in Syria. But on the other hand, last year, a professor wrote an article in which he said that, in fact, there is a strategy in Syria, and that strategy is called let it burn. Recently, there was another analysis in the U.S. in which it said there is a strategy and it is under the title The Bleeding of Syria. What are your thoughts about?
Where do we go after the negotiations? I can't predict where we're going to go. I have no idea, but I can say that I think that the absolute futility, the destructive nature, in fact, of involvement in this process over the last 20 years may finally have penetrated the skulls even of some Palestinian politicians. May, inshallah, have penetrated the skulls, even of some Palestinian politicians. Palestinian public opinion has figured this out. But a number of key Palestinian leaders apparently had not. This is a process that has been described as a peace process. I wrote a book about this called Brokers of Deceit. which came out last spring and is out now in paperback, in which I've argued that this was anything but a peace process. This is a process that has led to the tripling of the Israeli settler population, the immiseration of the Palestinian population, the entrenchment of the occupation. So you can call it a colonization process, you can call it a settlement process, you can call it a occupation process, you can call it anything you want, but not peace process. It has led to the subordination of the Palestinian Authority to Israeli security concerns. It has led to almost entirely negative consequences, except for a tiny stratum of Palestinians in Ramallah and in Gaza who benefit from the status quo, a fraction of the population. And I hope, and I think and hope, that it may be the case that this is a widely understood reality and that Palestinians will recognize that they have to follow a new strategy. Now, will they? I don't know. What strategy could they follow? That's a whole other question. Whether this reconciliation will be part of that, I don't know. It could be. Whether there will even be a reconciliation, Allahu A'lam. Who knows? Could be, could not be. The Palestinians need a consensus. Every strategist since Sun Tzu, Clausewitz, any strategist says the weaker party does not divide his forces in the face of a superior enemy, which the Palestinians have succeeded in doing for the past 10 years. The weaker party divides his forces and squabbles in the face of a stronger enemy. It's strategic imbecility. It's inexplicable. And yet this is the state of Palestinian politics. If they have finally gotten this into their heads, alhamdulillah. I mean, I think that neither of the two Palestinian parties has the slightest idea of a strategy. Neither has any idea of how to proceed. But developing a unified front and trying to work towards a consensus on how to proceed is obviously better than the status quo. And saying we won't negotiate except on clear bases would seem to me to be the proper way to approach things. And to say we have to change the balance of forces between Palestine and Israel, that Palestine is under occupation. We're not equal to the Israelis. We're not negotiating. I mean, there's so many badihiyat, so many basic things that are ignored in the current situation. I think hopefully all of these things should be addressed. Whether they will be, I don't know. I don't think this administration is going to try very much in the immediate future to do. They're not only unhappy at the failure of the negotiations, they're also pretty irritated with the Israeli government. Kerry ate humble pie and climbed down on his apartheid statement, but you read it very carefully. He didn't completely retract. And they are not going to let the Israelis get away with stuff. The unilateral measures that the Israelis are taking are not going to be well received. AIPAC will receive them well. Congress will receive them, but the administration will not. And a lame duck president after the November elections is not going to be any more adventurous than he has been, but he's not going to cut the Israelis very much slack. So I think that we are in maybe in a new phase. What it portends, I don't know. But I think that this has been one of the most destructive periods in Palestinian history. The only period even remotely comparable to post-Oslo was the period immediately after 1948. It has been a disastrous period of Palestinian history. Absolutely disastrous. And hopefully it will come to an end.
Just comment on, I mean, what's sort of stunning when you look at the region, that there no longer is an Arab-Israeli conflict. There's no Arab state that's in conflict with Syria. With Israel. Sorry, with Israel. And with all the uprisings and public sentiment and statements, turns out most of the populations, are worried about their own situation. And whereas many states were engaged previously and many publics were driven by the issue of Palestine, it's shocking today that with all of this, there no longer is an Arab-Israeli conflict. Maybe there's an Iranian-Israeli state conflict. It's become very much an Israeli-Palestinian issue. U.S. and Syria has not had really a strategy. I mean, to say, to give it a grand term. Initially, as the U.S. did in Egypt and Tunisia and other places, they stood back and expected things would happen quickly. There would be uprisings, and Assad would soon fall, and there were statements to that regard. And they said Assad must go. They expected it would happen sort of as it did in many other countries. When push came to shove, like it did in Libya, and the U.S. was asked, will it, support an intervention or a no-fly zone or something, a la Libya. Obama decided not to, partly because of the experience of Libya, partly because Europe also didn't want to do it, and partly because Russia and China would refuse to give a UN sanction to that. In those conditions, President Obama decided not to intervene. Things began to unfold. By the second or third year of the uprising, and it changed, morphed into a situation where Al-Qaeda has become now a major presence in the opposition. And for the U.S., Al-Qaeda is a much bigger threat than the Assad regime. And now that is something that they have to grapple with. Also, by this time, U.S. allies like Israel and Jordan were telling the U.S., please don't get rid of Assad because Al-Qaeda will be on our borders. Maybe we don't like Assad, maybe we'll have to worry about what to do, but please don't remove him in Damascus and the borders with Israel and Jordan, because that will bring Al-Qaeda ties to our borders. So this combination of things has left the U.S. Without really what I would call a strategy, but with a combination of decisions. What we're living through now is a slight adjustment. The U.S., first of all, Saudi Arabia changed the way it's dealing with the Syrian uprising slightly, removed Prince Bandar, put Prince Mohammed, is trying to focus more on Al-Qaeda, trying to arm people who are not as radical as Qatar and Turkey were dealing with. The U.S. is more okay with that approach. And after Crimea and after the failure of Geneva talks completely, where it was clear to Obama and Kerry that the Russians really are not going to help with a political resolution, the U.S. was faced with the reality that they have to put more muscle behind the opposition in Syria. But it will be very limited and very small. It will maybe succeed in allowing some parts of the opposition to hold their ground, but it will in no way weaken or defeat Assad. That's why maybe like Rashid, I also think this is measured in 10 years, 15. This is not ending. And partly because the U.S. is not willing to lead a coalition, whether through regional and international cooperation or simply who's willing to do it, to resolve this. I think that has ended up being not only the biggest human tragedy for our generation, and yet it's going to get much worse as things go on. It has also led to the emergence effectively of a new Al-Qaeda state in Syria and Iraq, which will threaten Europe and the U.S. There will be attacks. There will be things that are happening. It would have been probably easier to deal with this more quickly and more firmly. Russia might have acted differently had the U.S. been more forceful. But now it's clear that Obama is not, and he won't, and he's a lame duck. They will continue to take advantage of it, and things will get much worse in Syria, unfortunately. The issue of let it burn, the bleeding of Syria, that's not, I mean, there are people in Washington who have that view. It is not an administration view, it's not Obama's view. Let it burn, I mean, the burning is creating huge problems for the U.S., huge security problems, huge humanitarian problems. It's not a solution. So no, I wouldn't describe that as a strategy. It's much more dysfunctional, perhaps, than that.
Hi, my name is Olivia. My field is clinical psychology, so I think my question is going to be informed by that. And it relates to both of your comments on the impact of war and the impact of internal cohesion on the direction in which we go in the Arab world. One of the main impacts of trauma on individuals is a sense of foreshortened future and a lack of foreshortened future or lack of future. And just thinking about the intergenerational trauma that a lot of nations have been through, Lebanon, certain parts of Syria, the Palestinian people. I know we've talked a lot about the influence of sort of regional factors in determining how things are going to go, and I think it's very easy to feel helpless on more of an internal front. So I'm wondering, how important do you think is building civil society, national reconciliation efforts? Are those significant variables, do you think, and how significant are they in terms of determining our success in terms of moving towards democracy?
I'll do this one. Please. That's a tough question because certainly I don't have any expertise on trauma. But all I can say is that the impact of these things is actually probably longer lasting than we realize. I know my kids, when we left Beirut in 1983, when they were about a year old and about 6 and about 8, were affected for quite a while afterwards. And they had not suffered directly in any way. We had to move a couple of times because where we lived was unsafe. A lot of shelling, and they heard, bombing and explosions, and they felt our fear sometimes, but they never saw dead bodies. Where we were actually living was never hit while we were there. It was, we moved before and after. So whatever the impact is of in particular of displacement, I think that's probably one of the biggest causes of trauma. Not just death and destruction, but that leading to this long-term displacement. I don't know how long the impact of that lasts. I'm guessing longer than sometimes we may assume. And I'm in Lebanon a lot of the time, and one of the things I've noticed is that it's only now that some of the things that are a result of the 75 to 1990 war have finally been overcome. Some of those traumas some of them have been overcome, with people talking about Tal Zatar and people talking about things that happened in the 70s now in the 2010s, and the beginning of I don't know about healing, but thinking about how you deal with those issues. And I mean, Iraq is not finished. You can't talk about reconciliation in Iraq. The war is still ongoing. In the 11th year, it's still ongoing. We're in year 11 of this very low-grade civil conflict, in which I think maybe a quarter of the Iraqi population was displaced. And many of them have been redisplaced, who fled to Syria, are now being forced to flee Syria and go back to uncertain future in Iraq. And the Syrian thing is just beginning. So I think you're right that reconciliation and addressing trauma head on, personal and societal, is important. But the conflict has to end, in a sense, for reconciliation to take place. And Lebanon, one of the conflicts ended, that conflict that ended in 1990, but the country is now under this enormous pressure as a result of this regional Sunni Shia thing, as reflected specifically in the Syrian war. Do you want to?
Yeah, let me comment. I mean, definitely the issue of trauma, and we see it today in Syria. I mean, just 3 years ago, Syria was a sort of a stable, non-traumatized place, and just a few years after, it is way more than Lebanon and even more than Iraq in some cases, and that will go for generations. But looking at it from a sort of a historical perspective and looking at conflict or crisis, that crises like the Egyptian or Tunisian or whatever are also signs of change and signs of new forces emerging. Conflict is signs of change and high rising demands and the breaking of an old system. And historically, crisis and conflict is often also an opening to a historic opportunity. The European Union is the result of World War I and World War II. And the traumas of those wars and the necessity to deal with that created the European Union. A lot of democratic systems were the results of civil wars or deep internal conflicts where different classes or groups, in order to maintain peace, had to make a deal, which is not the kings, like you get this, we get that. These are the new rules of the game. Lebanon, in a way, is a kind of an example of that. We've had our wars, we know what it's like, and we've made our deals. Doesn't work great, we're in a difficult neighborhood, and but we're doing much better than many others. Iraq is fitfully stumbling along that course. It's teeters, a bit of civil war, a bit of politics. They have an election, then they have some fighting, they have another election. Syria, sadly, is in the early stages. Egypt is in early stages, between a civil society, an Islamic movement, an army. But these are societies that are going through demands for change, new identities, new forces. And historically speaking, yes, these come at a very high cost, but they also create historic opportunities. Constitutional orders are all effectively bargains. It's a deal. We'll write it down. These are the rules. This is what everybody gets. And usually without uprisings, demands, crisis, conflict, a ruler is never going to give that away. No ruler sits down and says, well, here are your rights. This is the new way. So in the long term, I'm sort of optimistic that at the end of the day, the only way forward is by negotiation, bargaining, and making agreements that everybody's okay with. There's no way back to establish the old-style dictatorships. The oil monarchies can hang on to it for a while because they have so much money and often very small populations. But they're the exception, and that won't last for long either. Given oil prices, domestic consumption, the whole, that's maybe a couple of decades, but even those are threatened with deep change. So I try to look at the potential for positive change.
Let me say one more thing, just building on what Paul just said. These processes really sometimes can be much longer than we realize historically. I mean, if you look at how long it took the French to establish a stable constitutional order from the time of their revolution, and I hope, I'm not suggesting we need to follow the path of the French. It's just one example. You had a revolution in 1789. You had a directory, you had an empire, you had a restored absolute monarchy, you had a parliamentary monarchy, you had a second republic, you had a second empire, you had a third republic, you had Vichy, a fascist authoritarian regime, you had a fourth republic, and it's only 171 years later that they finally achieved a stable, consensual order. And now we have Hollande. Yes, yeah. Yeah, with his casquette and his motor scooter. So, I mean, not all of those changes were attended by enormous violence, but some of them were. And it takes a while to develop a stable order. The United States is an exception in having a constitution that's been unchanged in all this period. So,
on sectarianism, I'm not really saying that we in Syria did not have it, but I really think that we in Syria had sectarianism that was feeding into opportunism, into abuses. And I was just hoping to know from both of you if there is an experiment in history where if you teach citizenry and if people do not insist on their holes that they've dug, the way the quota system is in Lebanon, if there is hope. I mean, I, for one, didn't believe that there was sectarianism. Not that I didn't know that. I felt that it was an abuse. I mean, somebody who's getting something that he doesn't deserve. And maybe one day someone can correct it without having to behead him. Any hopes?
Well, my quick comment, sectarianism, it's just a form of identity. It's become politicized and people are shooting each other because of it. There are other forms of identity in the past that have been used, whether it's tribalism or left and right. In North Africa, they're shooting at each other, Egypt and North Africa, they're shooting at each other for other identities, secular and Islamists. They want to kill the Islamists, they want to. Tunisia almost had a civil war, Egypt almost is in a, frozen civil war. Sectarianism in Sunni Shia sectarianism really did not emerge until the oil boom and the Iranian Revolution, those two factors. At that point, both the Gulf and Saudi Arabia, as Dr. Khalidi pointed out, and Iran instrumentalized sectarian identity as a political thing. And in their geostrategic fight and so on, they used it, they financed it, they armed, they trained, so that now in Iraq, which used to be divided along left-right, in the 50s, a huge communist demonstration, Ba'athis, nobody thought who was Sunni and Shia. I grew up in Lebanon. It was never a question, not only who's Muslim, who's Christian, but Sunni, Shia was not an issue that anybody could imagine could be politicized. So my basic point is, if you diffuse the Iranian Gulf conflict, this instrumentalization of this particular identity could be easily resolved. The way the uprising was dealt with in Syria, by the regime, and then the way the Gulf supported it, and Qatar and Turkey made it.
Supported the revolution. Yeah.
Supported the revolution, the uprising, turned it into that. It's also true that once shooting begins, communal identities become important because, it's different. And that happened in Lebanon, happened in Syria. So I'm not, I don't think there's a Sunni-Shia conflict in the Middle East. There's a little bit, but it's really an Iranian Gulf conflict. If they can come to peace, Iraq would be calm, Syria would be calm, Lebanon would be calm. Sadly, we're still a bit far from that. And with that, do we conclude, or you have some wise concluding?
I agree with everything.
Okay.